Hello, everyone. Have- hel- uh, Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Today, we're going to talk about rubber stamp assessing a large print approval plan. My name is Naz Torabi, and I'm Science Collection Coordinator at University of Toronto. And with me, my co-presenter is Eva Urchik. She's a humanities uh, um, collections coordinator. So let's get started. Next slide, please. Um, all right. So when we set to do this project, first we wanted to look at, based on literature review, what are the methods that we could use to assess a large approval plan in a large university library. In literature, there are different methods used. Some people look at the usage by book format. Some look at usage by acquisition methods. And you can even see that curriculum mapping has been done to align that with approval plan. Next slide, please. So there were so many different methods, and we needed to establish something that would actually work for us to address the purpose and the goal of this project. We really wanted to understand how this major approach plan was performing to support research and teaching. Also how it supports new academic programs and whether plan reflects the current and evidence-based collection development practices, including to what degree the plan contributed to diversity and inclusivity of our collection. Next slide, please. So before I start, I'm gonna give you some information about University of Toronto, just to provide you with some context, and also about the scope and size of approval plans that we were working with. Next slide, please. So the University of Toronto libraries are comprised of 42 branches at 3 campuses, serving over 80,000 students. U of T has over 700 undergraduate and 200 graduate programs. In addition to the vast print collection, the library holds 1.5 million electronic resources in various formats. Users interact with the library in very different ways. In-person visits, we would say more than 18,000 people can visit Robarts Library, the largest library on campus, in a single day. The central library system is comprised of 17 of those libraries that manage shared services for the whole university. The library's major approval plans operate on behalf of central library system, and the library selectors who manage the plan work at the libraries across the central system as well. Next slide, please. The US and UK approval plan that we will be talking about today is a library's most major plan. The print-only plan that we set out to review in 2021 shipped approximately to 20,000 volume per year. That includes approval books that come through slips and firm orders for the value of approximately 1 million. This plan covers subjects and materials published in English in United States and UK. The approval plan was established in 2014, and it was largely unchanged after that time. The library runs many other approval plans with vendors all over the world, but the plan under review is the most significant one for the library collection. Next slide, please. So we set out to do this project, and we divided into 4 stages. Phase 1 that ran between September to November 2021. We used that time to define benchmark for an optimally performing approval plan. We worked with selectors and liaison librarians to establish those benchmarks. During phase 2, which ran from December 2021 to March 2022, we collected and analyzed data to understand approval plan current performance against the goals that we set at phase 1. We work with a subgroup of selectors in that phase. During phase 3, which ran from April to July 2022, we worked with a approval plan vendor to revise and build against the defined criteria that we set during phase 1. And we worked with the selectors as well as Gobi representative to work through this phase. And at the last phase, because the work doesn't end at assessment, and it's kind of continuing right now, it's that we are reviewing the revised approval plan performance, and we basically tweak as we go, as we see anything that requires tweaking. Next slide, please. So during the first phase of the project, we started some conversation with selectors and liaison librarians, informal focus groups, and a survey to establish those benchmarks. Basically, when you look at literature, there is no kind of a defined matrix or criteria that fits all different approval plan when you want to define a successful approval plan. So we needed to establish these metrics and basically use that for the entire project. And basically, we were very aware of those metrics could also be different in different disciplines as well. Next slide, please. So we ran a couple of focus groups, and those focus groups allowed us to have a structured discussion to gather data directly from selectors who have a subject knowledge and work with approval plan all the time. We prepared for the focus group by creating a set of discussion guidelines that was used by the moderators. In general, the guideline laid out a set of topics for the group to discuss. And you can see the topics here. The first topic was to look at the standards of equity, diversity, and inclusion approval plan. The second topic was looking at the balance of approval plan versus books we receive through slips and firm orders. Topic three, we talked about receiving ebooks and approval plan and how that could duplicate the front list agreements in print. And later on in the presentation, we will talk more about front list agreements we have with other different publishers. And topic 4, we had a discussion related to usage and other measures that we could use for materials that we received through approval plan. So during these focus groups that they were held online, we limit the group size to about 4 people. There were 4 to 5 people, and the sessions were recorded and then we transcribed, and in the total there were 19 participants. The session transcriptions were then coded using NVivo to identify common theme, and the theme drawn from the focus group were then used that was sent to approximately 30 selectors to create a more quantifiable benchmarks. Next slide, please. So now I'm just sharing some of the responses we received through the survey, targeting the precision of approval plan. We basically wanted to know how much time selectors ideally need to spend to select the slips from approval plans. And we also asked them the percentage of slips that they receive should be selected. What's the ideal number? And as you can see, overall have a responses like to spend less than 60 minutes on slips weekly. So what we did, we started to look at the areas in the approval plan where the selector is spending more time reviewing the slips than benchmark for that area. And we try to find LC classes or publisher that can be sent to on approval plan, or how to find the materials being sent on slip that's never selected and removed from the plan. Next slide, please. Another thing we draw from the survey was what's the optimal comprehensiveness of the approval plan. And we asked what percentage of the English language publisher from whom selector acquires material do they expect to be covered by this plan. And that was specifically looking at the publisher that are being sent, the books from which publisher are being sent through approval plan. And we review the list of materials that are assigned for teaching or that are being used for research, looking at the citation database and reading list against the publisher being sent on approval plan. And particularly in area of study that fall below the benchmark. And next slide, please. Another thing we targeted was the relevancy of approval plan. How relevant the material we receive is, how they're being used for teaching and research. This slide showed the response related to teaching, and over half said that more than 80% of materials we received through approval plan more than 80% of the materials that are being used for teaching should come from approval plan. And next slide, please. And this one looks at the research, anything that's relevant to research. What we did after we receiving this, we reviewed the approval plans for an area where we firm ordering more materials that we receive on approval plan. And we try to do refinement to approval plan to ensure that it is aligning with the needs for research and teaching. So now I will hand it over to my colleague, Eva, to continue with the rest of the presentation.
Thanks, Naz. So I'm going to talk about how we looked at our data and what we found in that data. We were really eager to get our hands dirty and start looking at the data, but setting those benchmarks and figuring out what it was that we were going to be looking for was really important. So the first stage, though, before we could dive into the data, was getting it ready. So we were looking at title level information at about 100,000 titles. I think we said just over 99,000 titles first, and we, from our approval plan supplier, got a great deal of information about each individual title. And that's your basic bibliographic information: who is the author, who is the publisher, what is their reading level, but also what is the LC class, so what is the geographic focus, aboutness, what is the subject, really great information like that, which let us cut the data up in lots of different ways. Then also, ISBN, which wound up being the key identifier that we used across lots of different data sets. We conducted our analyses using Microsoft Excel, which, the pillar upon which LibraInship rests, but also RStudio, which was largely supported by some grad students that we had working in our office, and the built-in tools in Alma, which we used for things like to check duplication across our system. And before we could start doing anything else, we had to, combine everything into one data set, but also there was a lot of data cleaning. So things like the geographic focus, to make sure that those were all described at one level, things like the LC class, to reduce LC classes to a shortened LC. We went with two letters. So, taking a full LC and shrinking it down to just PA, for example, so we could easily compare and slice and dice. And as everyone is, I'm sure, familiar with cleaning ISBNs, so deciding what format you want your ISBN in and removing all those dashes and deciding that you're going to go with ISBN 13 and all that. So once we did that, we could start actually looking at our data in compared to the questions that we wanted to ask. So if you remember, the first focus of our discussion groups was a consideration of EDI, and that's where we started to look at our data. So we used the geographic focus of the particular works as a proxy for collection diversity. We knew all these books were coming from the US and UK, so we wouldn't expect there to be a large breadth of suppliers from around the world, but we were thinking about the aboutness of the books and were we covering the world comprehensively. So we made an assumption, and that assumption is that if there's a high percentage of firm ordered titles versus titles supplied on approval for a particular area, then we might be missing faculty needs or diverse content in our approval plan. So we found that on average, but across the board, across all areas of geography, about 64% of titles come on approval and about 36 are firm ordered. But for the United States and Western Europe, we found that 70% and 67% respectively are coming on approval and a lot less are being firm ordered. So we're finding that there's not the demand from faculty for these titles, for individual titles, but we're getting lots and lots on approval. But by comparison, for the Middle East and North Africa, only 50% of the titles that we're buying are coming on approval. So that suggests that our plan might be oversupplying works about the United States and Western Europe and undersupplying works about the Middle East and North Africa. And that's just that, that's this visualization in a little bit more detail. It's a better view of the slide from earlier. But it's important to note that you can't take a look at this data and run into decision making, because there's a lot of really important local context, and it's really important to work closely with your selectors and the people who know about historical decisions like we did. So because lots of these anomalies have explanations. For example, if you look at Canada, which is right here, it looks like our plan is vastly undersupplying material about Canada, which is bad because we're in Canada, we want those materials. In fact, what's happening is we have a separate approval plan for works that are published in Canada. So it's natural that we would receive very little on approval in this plan for Canadian materials. We would expect to receive very little. Materials that's being firm ordered through this plan actually probably shouldn't be. If they're Canadian publishers or selectors, should be ordering from the other plans. So there's maybe some adjustment to behavior and workflows that has to happen on our end, but there's not an adjustment to the plan. Yeah, and other anomalies can be explained away. Perhaps there was a single large research project that needed a vast number of titles, and your selector in a particular area might know about that, and you don't need to make an adjustment because that project has ended. So it is really important to consider local context when looking at this data. So the second thing we looked at is something that Naz spoke about already, and that's this workload issue. So how much time are we spending either firm ordering titles or looking at slips versus what's coming on approval? So again, we use that 64% benchmark. We expect 64% of titles to come on approval, 36% to be firm ordered. And in areas where our firm orders exceeded our approval purchases, in areas like practical theology, selectors reviewed the selections at a title level. So they really went through the list title by title to see if there are refinements they could make, to see if, like Naz said, there are certain publishers that should just be eliminated from the plan because they're always saying no, or are there some publishers that we're always going to order where we're getting so many firm requests for that we should just add them to the plan. So we're zooming in on that a little bit. So in some LC classes, and I think the P class is a really great example, you're just not going to be able to anticipate all faculty needs. If we're thinking about an area like literature that's so vast, we're always going to be doing a lot of specialized or firm orders. But in other classes, in Z class titles, are a good example. There are simple changes that were revealed by the data that translate to less manual work for the selector. And in this case, it was just the publisher ALA editions. We converted it to a send all publisher. So we said, we never want to think about ALA editions, just send us everything because we're always going to buy it. And that's a really, really simple change. It doesn't cost us any more money because we were really buying all those titles anyway, but it saves a lot of selector time. So the other major consideration, something we spent a lot of time on, is the consideration of ebooks. So ours was it was a print-only approval plan. We were firm ordering ebooks, usually for teaching, but really when we talked about 20,000 volumes arriving per year, we were talking about print volumes. And when we were introduced our local context earlier, we talked about central versus non-central libraries. So we're ordering on behalf of, our 18 central libraries, but there's a couple dozen other libraries that out in the system that are sort of doing their own thing. But when we buy electronic resources, all of our users all across the system have access to those resources. So we looked at our overlaps with those non-central libraries. So what did we purchase that you also hold in your collections? And we looked at those as good candidates for perhaps material that could be e-preferred. If we're buying it in multiple copies, let's just buy one multiple user copy. And when we looked at these, so when you see the red spots here, those are the areas where we had the LC classes. So at the top, you have LC classes, and along the side, you have libraries. So that's where the hotspots are, where we had a lot of overlap. But what we found when we dug into those titles, so we said, okay, you St. Michael's College Library, you're doing a lot of overlap with us in let's say J class titles. Let's dig in and look at what these are. And what we found was that we had a high degree of overlap where we were buying copies and they were buying copies for materials where we were actually already receiving an unlimited access copy via our front list agreement for ebooks directly with the publishers. So on principle, we were all okay with having a print copy when it was needed of an ebook. But what was less okay with having multiple print copies across the system where we had an unlimited access ebook. So that helped us make what wound up being a pretty easy decision about eliminating some of those print purchases to eliminate that duplication. So our users have no less content and we have a lot less crowding on our shelves. We also considered other measures of use. So we thought about circulation and those types of measures, but what wound up being a really important measure of use was use in courses. So we used the reading list software, Leganto in our case, and we got a big, massive data dump of all the material that had been assigned for courses through Leganto. And we used that compared with the records of what we had purchased to help us understand how well we were serving our needs for teaching. We looked at some other data too. We're not going to go into it today because it's pretty local, but we looked at faculty authored publications. We used citation databases to consider those to make sure that we're covering faculty authored publications. We looked at what faculty were citing, also using citation databases to make sure that we're covering that well. We did a review of circulation of approval material to understand circulation patterns. With those, with those three examples I just gave, we actually found that there weren't a lot of changes necessary, that we found that we were doing, the plan was doing a good job. But the course reading list and acquisition type, this was interesting to look at. So originally that big dump of data from Leganto had 16,000, almost 17,000 titles in it. We shrank it down because we were only interested in the titles that had been published between 2016 to 2020, because we were only interested in, the approval plan years that we were looking at. We wanted to compare it to our data set. So we shrunk that down to about 3,000 titles. And we found that about half those titles, a little bit more than half, were supplied by our front list agreements. So that's great. Another 600, or about 20% of the titles, were supplied by our approval plans. That's great. And it's important to note that we're only talking about US, UK approval plans. So 66% of the titles in total were supplied by either our US UK approval plan or through our front list agreements. An additional, I think we found it was 5 or 6% NAS of titles came through our Canadian approval plan. And then there are other plans that cover other regions of the world. So This says that 34% of titles were not covered by any purchasing agreement. That should say any of the agreements that we're talking about today. In total, over 70% of titles are covered by, either our front lists, our US UK plan, or our Canada plan. So when we think about that benchmark that we set earlier, that we want 70-80% of titles used for teaching to be supplied on approval, it seems like we're hitting that benchmark. We're all really happy about that number. An interesting thing that came out, though, is that we found that there were a handful of publishers, and not a lot, but a significant amount, where their materials were being assigned for teaching by our faculty, but they weren't supplied by any plan. And actually, you couldn't go in and order the book from our approval supplier. The publisher just wasn't covered. So that seemed like a good opportunity to share the names of those publishers and urge our suppliers to make some changes. And yeah, broaden the scope of what's available. So stage 3, we actually applied the changes. So we, communicated all this back, dumped a lot of data on our poor approval plan supplier. And here's what we changed. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time on this because it's not going to be useful for your local context. It's sort of really in the weeds for us. But we just wanted to show that there was substantive changes that came out of this, and it was really like based on those benchmarks that we set in stage 1 and the data that we looked at in stage 2. We added several publishers, send all publishers, where we found they were always being selected from SLIPs. That was a big one. Our science approval plan went all e-preferred. Some frontlist frontlist publishers were removed from our approval plan. We added a U of T authors, a print approval plan. Those were materials that we knew that we wanted on print. So all of this really supported by the evidence that we found. Again, very local to our context, but it has resulted in significant changes around here. Then also something that we're really happy about is the addition of these new publishers. So we found, like I said, these were being assigned for teaching with our approval plan partner. We were able to add, I think we identified 19 or 20 publishers. 6 of them they've now added, 5 are still sort of in review. They're looking to see if there's sufficient output. A couple of examples: Mowenzi House is a publisher committed to promote literature that reflects the growing cultural diversity of Canada. Abrams Comic Arts is a publisher of graphic novels and illustrated works about the creators and the history of comic arts, animation, and cartoons. So those are some areas, a publisher that strengthens the diversity of our collections. A graphic novels publisher, that's somewhere that we found that we had some weakness. So we're happy that those publishers are now both going to be available to us on approval, but also to the other institutions that use our same approval plan suppliers. So that felt like a great win and something that we saw in there. And then phase 4, like my colleague Naz alluded to, is where we are now. And this is the iteration phase. So we applied all these changes, and it's not perfect. We've had to make little tweaks as we've gone. We sent some areas to e-preferred. There were some surprises, I guess, in the way that we had set up the LC classes. So we've gone back and done some iteration, but that's to be expected. And we'll be really interested to see at the end of the first year what this looks like in terms of number of volumes, what this looks like in terms of our print versus e-split, and how our selectors are feeling, both about their own workload and what they're hearing from their faculty partners about the results of this work. So I think that's it for us in terms of presentation. And we're happy to take any questions either now or via email. I've listed our contact information here. So thanks everyone very much for listening, and we will stay tuned for questions.